So let's say the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu
Yitzchak,
v'tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah. All right. So we'll start at 35:1 and we'll take it down to.
There's a paragraph break at 6.
Yeah. All right, well, let's do that. Why not? Who would like to read?
Let's let Leslie do it since she hasn't had a chance to read for several months.
Okay, thank you. All right.
All right, you're on.
But
Okay.
you're on 31. Can I move it up?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, okay, I'll read. Okay, I was going to read off of my real book, but I'll read off the screen. Okay. So, okay. Further, yeah. So the Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho, saying, instruct the Israelite people to assign out of all of the holdings a portion to them, towns for the Levites to dwell in. You shall also assign to the Levites pasture land around their towns. The towns shall be theirs to dwell in, and the pasture shall be for the cattle they own and all their other beasts. The town pasture that you are to assign to the Levites shall extend 1,000 cubits outside the town wall all around. You shall measure off 2,000 cubits outside the town on the east side, 2,000 on the south side, 2,000 on the west side, and 2,000 on the north side, with the town in the center. That shall be the pasture for their towns. Okay. The towns that you assign to the Levites shall comprise the 6 cities of refuge that you are to designate for a manslayer to flee to which you shall add 42 towns.
Okay, let's stop there.
Okay.
And we're obviously describing the situation that the Levites had, namely, okay, they don't own holdings where they're concentrated as the other tribes do. But there are 2 features of this that look pretty interesting to me. One is that the Levites were sort of sprinkled throughout the land of Israel, and not in one particular area only, which has some interesting implications, I would say, for the way in which the text envisions the Levites to sort of leaven all of the Israelites' holdings, so they're not segregated in one particular area, and that explains a little bit about what the role of the Levites was. When you consider that there were undoubtedly more Levites than there were necessary in the temple itself at all times, they had to live somewhere. But they didn't. They are dissociated from the land itself. They don't own the land. They're just living at the sufferance, so to speak, of the other tribes, but they are dotted around the country, they're bringing their particular ideology and their knowledge to all the different tribes. At the same time, one of the things that's interesting is that they encircle each of the tribal holdings, and there's in terms of where their pasture land is. So it's a replication to a certain degree of the structure, the geography of the Israelite encampments as they were in the wilderness itself. Okay, so that's one side of what's going on here. And there's something more there that we could talk about. But I also want to spend a a little bit of concentrated time on the cities of refuge. Is this an idea that anybody has heard of before?
Mhm.
Yeah. So what do you know about the cities of refuge?
Well, it was for, as I recall, um, if if you inadvertently killed someone,
Uh,
okay, not intentionally, it was an accident, whatever, and to prevent uh, uh, families clashing and fighting, the person who inadvertently killed someone could go to a city of refuge, and
right.
the mishpocha of the person who died could not attack him. But
That's
it
right.
was only for inadvertent, not for intentional. I have a quick question on the text in that first paragraph. You
Oh,
got the town in the middle, then 1,000 cubits for the Levites, and
right.
then it's the 1,000 outside in the total of 2,000 cubits for the rest of the town. Is that how it worked?
Well, it's kind of a ring or a circle that encompasses the the towns that are part of the tribes per se. So within, let's say, the area that's known for that belongs to I don't God, for example, there are towns that are composed of people who are Gadites. But around those towns, there is a kind of ring uh, provided by the Levites. It's when you consider it, uh, it may not be a practical description of a practical reality. Reality. There can't be that many Levites or that few towns that belong to the tribal members themselves, so that each town or village had a ring of uh, uh, Levites around it. But I think the idea is more of a sort of an aspirational one. That the idea is that the Levites are going to be present in all the tribal holdings themselves and sprinkled in among them, as opposed to being separated into their own territory only. This has certain implications when you think about it, because the Levites are there, inevitably will be representatives of the temple in Jerusalem, and therefore are going to kind of bring into the territory of the other tribes whatever presence or whatever values might be a part of uh, being a Levite, uh, and it's not going to leave. Uh, it's a way of sort of impregnating the tribes with some kind of awareness of the temple in Jerusalem. Levites, after all, were regular leaders of the sacrifices along with the Kohanim, and had that awareness of a spiritual connection. So that's one side of what's going on. Um, how would that be related to this idea of a a city of refuge? I mean, Stan is quite right in how he describes the function of the cities of refuge. Why would you need such a thing? Or why might you need such a thing? What is, there is the positive side of bringing the consciousness of the temple in Jerusalem into the territory of the other tribes, representing that. What's the practical or the political impact of having the Levites scattered around the other tribes?
Okay. I was going to answer about the cities of refuge. You're
Well, that's
preventing
okay.
youth.
Well, well, the cities of refuge is related to this as well. But let's ask the question: why are the Levites placed around the other towns? They kind of form a protective ring. There was somebody who was going to pursue a rotzeach, somebody who commits kills somebody else. They'd have to go through the territory that is the encampment of the Levites. That provides a little bit of a buffer. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I was just wondering, in terms of the role of the Levites being throughout the land, it almost sounds analogous to the Catholic Church and the local priests to make sure that people are praying correctly, that their thoughts don't deviate from Torah in our case, or something of that nature.
Yeah, I think that's definitely within their purview. I don't think they are. Yeah, Leslie.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, they're doing all this settlement, right? And they haven't crossed into Canaan yet, correct?
Well, this is how they would distribute themselves in Canaan.
In Canaan. So even though they're in Jericho, this is not the setup for Jericho. This is the setup to when they walk into Canaan, they'll be ready to they have the plans.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just read ahead, just like a couple of areas, and it said that, so you're going to have the 3 cities set aside beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 will be in Canaan. So even as he's talking in Jericho, he's already talking about the 3 cities of refuge that would be in Jericho before you even get to Canaan. So they're not going to settle in Jericho. Is that the plan?
Well, Jericho is a part of Canaan,
Okay.
but you're right. Jericho doesn't belong to any of the tribes, so it's not going to be part of Israelite territory, even though it is within the boundaries of Canaan as they were described earlier in the text.
But they don't want to settle in Jericho. They're heading. No. Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah. So why would you need a city of refuge? Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that somebody, as Sam describing it, inadvertently causes the death of somebody else. We're not talking about not murder, but some sort of accident or inadvertent killing. Why would you need a city of refuge?
Remy's got her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Remy, I can't see you.
Sorry. I'm kind of thinking that the refuge, the city of refuge, it's like a period, a cooling off period. If there is a friction or a killing, it will give both parties or the tribal members have a chance to rethink, and it's protected. I'm also thinking just a few minutes ago, why the Levites around, like you said, they are a buffer. I have a question. Could it be, since the Levites don't own land, am I right? They are not a threat to anyone, since they are considered like upper echelon. They are involved in the sacrifices, so they all have relationship to all the other tribes.
That's true, but let's look at it from the other point of view. They may not. Their presence facilitates something else. They are in a position to use their good offices to help in the process of atonement for the other Israelites. So being present is a way to make that more effective. It's not so much that they can do something aggressively or intentionally, but if they were less available, their services would also be less available. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So in this context, you have to be aware of the fact that in the ancient world, revenge killings were a part of life among many different peoples. And even though there might be no murderous aspect to a killing, there is, after all, the notion of the preservation of life, and that affected nations throughout the ancient Middle East, who would then have to exact, so to keep the balance sheet square. And if you kill one of ours, we get to kill one of yours. So to stop that process of revenge killings, these cities of refuge were a solution. If somebody inadvertently killed somebody else and there was an attempt, or there was the threat of an attempt to take revenge, then there was a place that that this person could run to in order to be protected. Now, it's hard to say whether or not how effective this was, but the concept that there is a place that somebody can go to who otherwise would have been under threat from some sort of retaliation is an interesting idea in and of itself. That is to say, this is a universally accepted norm in the ancient world, but this would be one way of putting an end to that. Oh, sorry, somebody at the door, but I'm not going to bother them. So why would this be an effective or a preferred way of stopping revenge killings? What would be, why couldn't you just say you're not allowed to do it?
Well, it would prevent family feuds, wouldn't it?
Well, it would, but how would it do that? How would it do that better than, for example, simply saying you're not allowed to act out of revenge?
Well, wouldn't the townspeople in the cities of refuge have to defend the person?
They would have to, yes. I think one thing to bear in mind is that there is also this principle of a life for a life, which we know elsewhere in Torah. So the cities of refuge would continue this notion that only a life is equivalent to a life. So the problem would be if you're saying to somebody, look, you have this kinsman or what have you who has been killed. you can't just say, all right, we're not going to count it. But at the same time, you don't want people taking revenge with any kind of regularity. So this was the way of solving the problem of preventing revenge killings, while at the same time not abrogating the principle of only a life is equivalent to a life. So that was kind of, I think, a novel way of approaching the problem. It was a unique institution in the ancient world.
It seems like it was an acknowledgement that something had happened
Yes.
also.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that people would have these emotions, wanting to take revenge.
I mean, there is a little bit of a sacrifice when you leave where you live and go
Yeah.
off.
That's true.
And
You're
so the person has suffered some by going to the city.
Well, yes, they become dissociated from their tribal kinsmen, and that's a loss. But it is not a loss which says that you're not accountable for the death of this other person. You are accountable. So, but it stops the internecine actions that might otherwise ensue, one tribe having to exact revenge from another.
It
So-
also removes the incident from the community, so the community can go on.
Yes,
And we
That's
see
right.
what happens here when we have that kind of thing. We'll have a lot of protests, for example.
I'm not sure I know exactly.
Well, like
Sure.
with some of the killings that have occurred with policemen,
Oh.
you know, it wrecks the community. I'm not saying it's not justified, but there is that effect that we go from one occurrence to the next.
Yeah, in line with that, I think you might be able to say that the cities of refuge support the idea that even in the face of the what I want to say, the understandable impulse to take revenge, nonetheless, the shared identity as Israelites takes precedence, and revenge is not permitted, without at the same time devaluing the life of anybody who is killed from among the different tribes.
Do we have any idea how long they would go to that city of refuge?
Well, I think that they wind up staying there for a very long time, but I'm not sure what the absolute limit is.
Kirby has his hand up,
Oh, Kirby,
but
can you
you're
help
muted.
that?
Yeah, for the man who is accused of manslaughter,
Yeah,
that individual must stay at that city of refuge until the death of the high priest.
so we're talking about potentially quite a while.
Right.
But there is
Correct.
termination,
Well, yeah, with the death of the high priest.
right?
I
Well,
guess they could leave at that point. I'm not clear on that point.
yeah, but I think that that's true. I mean, I don't believe that that you had to stay permanently in the city of refuge, but it could be a long time, depending on how old the high priest was. Although, there's a seniority system among the priests, so the person is not likely to be a young person who is the high priest. So, eventually somebody's going to die. What would be the connection, do you think, Kirby? Maybe you have an idea about this. Why would the term of that somebody would spend in the city of refuge be connected to the high priest at all? What is the rationale for that having an impact on the term that somebody would spend in the city of refuge?
I've not read an explanation, and I think what maybe it was Kim who suggested it be maybe a prolonged cooling off period. But after that high priest died, according to verse 28, I think, in this chapter, then that individual may return to their own property.
Yeah.
But why it's tied in with the high priest, I don't know. Again, cooling off period, I can't do any better than that. I'm not
Cooling
read.
off period, I think, is part of it, but it only begs the question. I mean, why would the life or the death of the high priest be connected to this idea of a cooling off period? Rennie, do you have an idea?
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of thinking that since the Levites work closly with the high priest, so they have that direct contact to the high priest, their officials in the temple. It just makes sense when people are running the government or running a community. It makes sense that the Levites will be next in line to inform the high priest what's going on in the community. It's just, to me, just logic.
Well, I think that is true, but I want to point out the practical role of the high priest.
Maybe they would send the person to the city of refuge.
Well, I think that is even more generally, they are the ones who oversee the setting up and the security of the cities of refuge. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I just pulled out this commentary that we've got. Here's Rashi on verse 25, until the death of the high priest. That's the text.
Right.
The high priest's job is to cause the Shekinah to rest upon Israel and to lengthen their days, while the killer drives the Shekinah away from Israel and shortens life. His free existence is therefore incompatible with that of the high priest. Another reading, because the high priest ought to have prayed that no such tragedy occur in Israel in his lifetime. It can only be wiped out by his death. So that's Rashi on that.
Okay. Well, that's helpful because it points us in the direction that there is a programmatic and as well as a spiritual connection between the structure that is set up and maintained by the high priest and his minions, so to speak, and the lives of the other Israelites. So it's sort of the flip side of saying that the high priest and the other priestly folks are responsible for the other Israelites, their spiritual and social cooperation, well-being, and so forth. So who maintains the integrity of these cities of refuge? Who's responsible for their security, so forth? That would be the high priest and his followers. Yeah.
I have a question. So these are people who've already been tried somewhere. They've had a trial somewhere.
The text doesn't mention a trial.
Right. Well, somewhere someone has to have decided that this was an inadvertent killing. It was manslaughter versus murder, right?
That's right.
So somewhere, some judge, some Levite has already decided this in some community. And then the person is removed from that community and put in to the cities of refuge that are maintained by the Levites. That's their part of the responsibility. Is the judgment, is the law system,
Yes.
is the penal system, whatever, right? So that would fit in why they would be doing that. But at some point there's been a trial, because otherwise it would have just been these revenge killings, et cetera. So we have decided, somewhere someone's decided this was inadvertent.
Yeah, it's been decided that it's not murder.
Right. So where,
It could be manslaughter or some other uh, 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 model of responsibility.
right, you dig a ditch and someone fell in it and they died, you know, that sort of, okay. But I mean, you know, very accidental. But so, but this has been decided somewhere else. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Kirby.
Yeah, Kirby, you're on. Can't hear you, Kirby.
That's right. The person seeking asylum was to appear at the entrance, member, of the city gate. And that's where the city elders and judges heard and settled a
Right.
variety of judicial cases. And if the case was determined to be accidental, then the Levitical city would offer asylum and sanctuary. Yeah, it was at the city gate where judicial issues were decided in all these communities.
That's right. And but not just the cities of refuge, other cities as well.
Correct, correct.
And not just the issue of life and death, but other kinds of conflicts, whether it's a civil conflict or a criminal conflict. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, this is a comment from someone I've never heard of, the Core Shore. And it says, we do not know how long the victim would have lived had he not been killed, not presumably longer than the priest who serves in the presence of the Holy One. So the manslayer spends as much time in exile as he deprived the victim of. For this purpose, we do not take differing ages of the victim and the priest into account.
Yeah. Well, it's you know, it's sort of like figuring out how long somebody maintains their position. You know, this is, I don't want to make a flip comment about it, but figuring out the reign of the high priest and what does that imply for the rest of the Israelites is a question that is has other repercussions as well. So it might be that there is the idea that somebody who needs to avail themselves of the service is doing it under the aegis or during the period of the reign of the high priest, at which point all bets are off. And with a new high priest, we sort of start back at point A again. It's sort of a reset, and this idea exists in other contexts as well.
Like the Jubilee.
Like the Jubilee, it's a good example. Or oddly enough, when we count the age of agricultural produce or of animals like horses, they all start and stop at the same time, even though it may not exactly correspond to the actual number of days involved. You know, all horses become 1 year old on the same day. So the idea of time is a little bit different when it comes to determining the length of the status or the functionality of a person or a horse, or when fruit can be eaten, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I want to raise this question in a little bit of a different context. And I know we're nearing the end of our hour together today.
No, we go till 1:15.
1:15, right. So we got about a little under 20 minutes left to go.
Yeah.
So the question I want to raise is, with all these ideas, cooling off period, or the idea that the spiritual guides of the community are sprinkled around the rest of the people so forth, all the things we've talked about are efforts, I think, to try to recognize the existence of certain human emotions like revenge or anger, recognizing that you can't really accomplish the banning of those feelings, but you want to avoid the effect that they might have on society. We can look at the cities of refuge as an attempt to do exactly that. And it occurs to me that this idea has some possible applications even in our society and in our day. Namely, that it may not take this kind of form, but it would be a good idea if we could intervene, sort of nip in the bud these emotions.
It's 1 o'clock.
And try to blunt or deflect them. When you think about drive-by shootings or, yeah, Leslie, what do you want to say?
It's also very interesting that like they're pulling up the plan for the city, and the plan for the city already has this as an integral part of it.
Yes.
That we're not going to be perfect people. These things will happen. We have laws, we have judges, we have to deal with this. And this is just part of city planning.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And the idea that this is embedded in the structure of how, as you're pointing out, how the cities are laid out, how they're planned, and so forth, is an important idea. Why? Because it recognizes that the solution to conflict, even extreme conflict where death is a part of the situation, requires a practical limiting of the exercise of those emotions, recognizing the emotions are going to exist and that trying to abolish them will not be successful. How do we at the same time preserve the life of people who are innocent? It might be the object of revenge. This is the solution that they came up with in ancient Israel. This exact solution might not apply in our societies today, but it would point to the possibility of trying to create some other modality for preventing the taking of refuge, providing a limit, so to speak, on what the freedom of action might be that people will perceive that they have available to them in responding to some sort of family disaster along these lines. Yeah, Remy, do you want to say something?
You're muted.
Moving this period to the present time. And I am thinking it's almost like you said, conflict resolution. And also the city of refuge could also, this is a question to you, Rabbi, could it be also be compared to like a rehabilitation time where a person can be rehabilitated?
Well, I think that's a possibility, but I think that the rehabilitation happens on both sides. Those who are apt to act out on their anger or their sadness or whatever it is that might lead them to want to retaliate for the death of a kinsman or a family member, and at the same time to provide a safe haven for those who would be liable to be attacked. This is the cooling off period kind of idea, but it requires a practical arrangement. Why? Because you can't just say to somebody, don't do it. Now, the reason I put it that way is that one of the practical qualities that Judaism in general, whether it's the biblical period or later, is to recognize the reality of human emotions and to approach dealing with them in very pragmatic ways. So, for example, this is we would think this as problematic. I think some were in the minds of some. But let's say, for example, there's a man who is attracted to an adulterous relationship. You know, they find a woman attractive. What do you do about that? Well, the attraction is a real emotion that a person might have, but you can't let people act that out. So if you're going to engage in an adulterous relationship, you have to go away and do it somewhere else. So it doesn't affect your family or your community. So you go somewhere where you're not known, and you have the adulterous relationship there. I mean, you can say, or just don't have the adulterous relationship, but people are going to do that. They're going to have them anyway. So in this case, whether it's let's say he's not convinced. It's all right.
No, because I think that even going away and having an adulterous relationship still affects the family back home.
Well, it might.
I don't think it's not like you can separate this. But I do have another question. Okay.
One quick point.
Sure.
The emotion of lust is going to persist. The question is, how do you blunt that? How do you minimize the impact? And you're right. It's not going to eradicate it, but it's a way of trying to practically deal with it. Go ahead, Leslie.
So my other question is, so we've been talking about these cities of refuge for people who inadvertently kill someone. What was the punishment for killing for a non-inadvertent?
Life for a life. Yeah, that's the principle.
And where was that done, and how was that done?
Well, it was almost never done.
Right. That's right.
The idea was to maintain the absolute moral equality of all life. So there was only one way of dealing with taking the life of another person. That was to take the life of the person who caused it. But that's not that has its own moral ambiguities as well. So the dilemma was, how do you uphold the absolute sanctity of life while at the same time holding people responsible if they have acted in a way to end the life of another person? That's a problem in law in general, and in Jewish law no less. If you, other than taking revenge, which is after all what capital punishment is, and is not absolvable any more than the taking of life otherwise, how do you solve that problem of asserting the absolute quality of life without making others now responsible for the taking of life, whether it's the state or whoever?
So where do these people go?
I'm sorry, which people?
People thought it wasn't inadvertent, but closer to murder, but they weren't willing to do, you know, a capital punishment, where do
Yeah.
these people sit? I mean, what happened to them?
Well, there was a system of jails and so forth.
Okay.
You could be imprisoned by the priesthood.
Okay,
Right?
got it. All right.
If you think about it, we have a very famous example in biblical history, namely the trial of Jesus. Yeah, you know, how we know about this from that example is that the limits of the priesthood were such that they could not exact capital punishment, especially for political crimes. That was the province of the Romans only. So the priests were not in a position to pass judgment on Jesus. Yeah, Kirby.
Oh, Leslie, I'm not sure. Clarify your question. Are you asking what happened to the person convicted of manslaughter?
Oh, not manslaughter, but murder.
Murder.
Well, murder. Well, as I understand it, and Rabbi said something that made me ask a question, but that person could be turned over to the avenger of blood for execution. Now, Rabbi, you said something just a moment ago that suggested that didn't happen very often, but that is what is supposed to have happened. You turn it over to the avenger, the kinsman, and he takes care of it. All right. Now, are you saying that didn't happen very often?
I'm saying that didn't happen very often, that it was to be avoided. And the reason it was to be avoided is that if you uphold the principle of the absolute quality of the sanctity of life, you're not necessarily helping the situation by authorizing somebody from the injured tribe or injured clan to kill the person responsible. Because now we're dealing with something that is not manslaughter, not accidental. Now we're dealing with something that is intentional. And whether that becomes, in fact, a kind of murder is an open sort of question. So it was for the benefit of the avenger, as well as the benefit of the person who inadvertently took the life, to stop that process so that further guilt was not incurred. Now, this is an approach which says, look, we don't want to undercut the absolute sanctity of life by saying that there's something else than life which is equal to the value of life. But at the same time, you can't make it nothing either. So, yes, Dan.
I was just thinking, one of the reasons, to go back to Kirby's question, one of the reasons I think that it occurred so rarely was the witness requirement, wasn't it? That you had to have 2 live witnesses or something or more to any event.
Wasn't it more that you had to have 2 people to warn the person?
Out of the mouth of 2 or 3. And yeah, so yes, it didn't happen very often because the rules of evidence were very stringent. Why? Because you want to avoid the taking of life, even in retribution for a life that was taken. You don't solve the problem by adding more executions. Yeah, Kirby.
I don't know if this will answer anybody's question, but in Deuteronomy, the 19th chapter, verses 11, 12, and 13, let me read that. But, quote, but if out of hate someone lies in wait, assaults and kills a neighbor, and then flees to one of these cities, the killer shall be sent for by the town elders, be brought back from the city, and be handed over to the avenger of blood to die. Show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood so that it may go well with you.
Well, now this is not exactly manslaughter necessarily. although it could include that.
That was murder.
That was, yeah, because you're lying in wait. Exactly. Yeah. So these definitions, these limits, are sometimes very, very fuzzy. I think in part that's the difficulty. You know, emotion is going to enter into these situations no matter what, and people are going to argue about whether or not the killing was inadvertent or not inadvertent, whether somebody is responsible, how much are they responsible. I mean, all of these determinations get addressed, and unfortunately, they get addressed in terms of the emotional reaction of the people who are affected by the death. Acting out of emotion here is part of the problem, and for that reason, there is a need to separate the parties to create time and space when the emotions can cool down. The idea that people are going to somehow not be affected by the death of a family member or a kinsman, even if it is inadvertent, is at best naive, if not counterproductive. So people are going to look at it from the point of view of how do we maintain the sanctity of life, at the same time that we limit the area of action that a person can take in trying to uphold that value. It's easy to think that somebody might say, look, I can't allow this death to go unrequited. But at the same time, if somebody does act out of that anger or sadness or hatred as a result of the death of a kinsman or a family member, further guilt, so to speak, is being incurred. And we just keep going merrily down that spiral without any end in sight. So any end is, to a certain degree, arbitrary, but an end can only be affected when the emotions have cooled off enough for that end to be a possibility. And that's why it makes as much sense to say that the period of protection that a person might be extended in the cities of refuge ends with the life of the end of the life of the high priest. I mean, it's going to be an arbitrary point, no matter what. So for that reason, it's not as if we say, okay, you're going to serve X number of years in prison, at which point people are no longer going to feel the way they have been feeling. They're probably going to continue to feel that way for some time. I know, I'm aware, thank you, Kim. So for that reason, you pick a time, and the death of the high priest seems as logical as any other. All
So
right.
Are we to understand then that these folks who unintentionally committed the crime and they are in this city of refuge, that they are in a certain kind of prison, or are they free to roam? Do they have restricted movement because they did commit an unintentional, I mean, whatever degree?
They're not in jail. They are free to move within the area that is designated as a city of refuge. So they can pursue their pastures and so on and so forth, a normal sort of life, but they've got to stay within those boundaries. And the reason, of course, is obvious, that if they stray from there, they are liable to come into contact with the folks who have been hurt or damaged or who are grieving for the death of the person that was killed by the slaughterer.
So whatever level of crime they have committed that is below murder and all that, they are sort of not held accountable for that in the sense that they are not, other than being restricted to that city, they are not.
Well, no, they're not. I mean, in a way that you look at it and you say, well, what really could you do?
Oh,
to-
community service or
Well,
something.
the whole point is that there's nothing equal to life. So since there's nothing equal to life, what actually can you do? You know, submit them to some kind of noxious personality? I don't know. All right, but Kim is pointing out that we have reached our time limit for today. So we're going to stop now.
Yeah, but what about next week is the 24th?
Yeah, it's Erev Christmas. So I don't know. I mean, I'm available.
And I'm available.
I'm available.
I'm
I'm
available.